Thank you for tuning in to the Peoplz and Dragons. If you enjoy the content we provide, then subscribe, like, and maybe join in on the action at www.pndrpg.com. Haven City, an ugly city. Episode 5, Operation Smoke Show. We fade into a dark and fancy office space inhabited by dozens of bodyguards lining the walls, with a few attractive women sprinkled about lounging under the lofty purple vapors of high-end recreational chems. These smogs are illuminated by the purple strobing lights emanating from the massive 15-yard bulletproof glass window that overlooks the nightclub down below. We were in Palladia, a renowned and poppin' nightclub owned by a well-connected big shot that no one wanted to cross. The door to the office swings open and in walks Lectern, a ordinary man dressed in what appeared to be a hybrid dress suit and trench coat made of durable yet comfortable dark blue fabric. A getup only the wealthy would be seen donning. He was accompanied by a bodyguard tasked with clearing the room out, even shooing away the other guards until everyone was gone. Lectern makes a beeline for his desk and accesses his desktop computer. It was an old artifact. Black screen, green print, and it chomped on floppy disks, but it served its function. It showed him who owes money and how many seconds they were behind on their installments. Lectern finds the name on the screen he was looking for, squints his eyes, then turns around to the window to observe his successful empire while taking a long drag from his cigar. Palladia nightclub was the place to be on a weekday night. Lectern pulls his cigar from his mouth as he eagle eyes a particular person indebted to him, down on the floor enjoying themselves. Lectern tells his bodyguards that it's time to collect. We cut to a man in his early 30s, partying the hardest out of everyone in the middle of the dance floor. He can be seen pouring an entire bottle of high-end champagne all over the surrounding ravers, from atop the shoulders of a much larger, topless woman, high off its Tyrolean shrooms, named Miss Gravy Pie. You weren't partying unless you were being hoisted in the air by Miss Gravy Pie. Just before he could order another 4 bottles of champagne for the people, the man is grabbed off of her shoulders and thrown to the ground, hitting it hard. Before he could gather himself, while dazed and high as a kite, the man is dragged through the crowd and taken outside behind the building by his unknown captors. Disoriented with fuzzy vision, the man finds himself in an alleyway amongst trash. Filth and juices splattered all over his fancy white silk dress clothes. He comes to his senses when he hears his name being called out by a familiar voice. "You have some big cojones, Mr. Knight." Knight looks up and sees a buff bodyguard, and beside the guard is the last person he wanted to see. It was Lectern. The audacity to show up on my property, spending and consuming my provisions, having a good old time when you owe me your life savings. Knight gulps and thinks to himself, pondering how stupid and high could he have been to completely forget about the several tabs he loaded up over the past few days at Palladia and ditched out on. It was like owing a mob boss money. Knight face palms, then is kicked in the face by Lectern and onto his back. The bodyguard lifts him up and holds him in place. Lectern walks up to him. Knight is dizzy and tries to show respect by looking into his eyes. Lectern was usually behind the curtain, and unless it was about business, you'd rarely see him. Unfortunately for Knight, it's now about business. Lectern reaches into his pocket, retrieves a silver pen, and unravels a contract. "You'll pay for your debts as my assistant." Lectern hands him the pen and calls over another assistant specifically there for the purpose of being a hard surface to bear on. Knight knows about Lectern's quote-unquote assistance and is mildly hesitant. He begins to squint in order to even make out the contents in the contract when suddenly the flattened metal rod on Lectern's wrists extends out and is jabbed into Knight's chest, sending violent jolts of electricity through him, sending him to the ground. The guard lifts him back up. Lectern slaps him across the face and holds the pin out and demands that the Knight take responsibility for his debts, as it was the moral thing to do. He assures Knight that it will only be a little labor, then he'll be free to go. Knight's teeth now taste like metal, and he wished not to be shocked again. Knight begins to sign his name. William White Knight. Lectern looks over the contract, rolls it up and tucks it in his pocket. He tells the bodyguard to get Knight an apron and that his shift starts tonight. Lectern heads back into the building. Knight holds himself, quivering as the electric currents faintly ripple through him. He's frightened at the fact that he likely signed his freedom away. A commonality in the Golgan district. The bodyguard hands him a Palladia apron. We cut to William White Knight carrying an order to a group of secluded patrons sitting at the bar in the corner. He walks in on an intense conversation as we see a buzzed Looper Ken, Marshall Mesa, and Jacob Bastian discussing in major detail their plans to disrupt a criminal rendezvous occurring the following night. Looper and Jacob met shortly after assisting Gate during Grenfall. Looper has gone rogue since departing from the Western Ward Constabulary and believed that if vigilante justice was going to be served, he would need to network with vigilantes. Jacob was just that, a merc, frequently hired by Marshall Mesa with the soft spot for helping the innocent, but more importantly keeping Mesa Mark clear of undesirables. Looper relaxes his shoulders and takes a deep breath. Lately he's been incognito and undercover in plain common clothes. He forgot how soft and comfortable that could be. Although his Steel Blocks membership made him one baklava balaclava away from taking someone's eye out with his top button, he extends his big bulky arm over the table and points at a location on the map that sprawled across the entire table, highlighting where Marshall should be planted. Marshall Mesa acknowledges the distance and inquires about the high-tech pair of combat optic binoculars that he asked Jacob to acquire. Jacob isn't paying attention though, and has drifted off, having eye sex with an attractive Doloman woman on the dance floor, body rolling seductively. She was a smoke show. Looper throws a balled up wad of paper that once wrapped a straw at Jacob's face. He snaps back to reality. He frequented this spot, and it was his preferred go-to lounge area between contracts. He tells Marshall about how he went shopping for that gear that he was asking about, but his Connect didn't have any high-tech accessories. He usually just has guns. Besides, the black market has been dried up lately. Some sort of halt on all sales to everyone, it seems. Jacob grins and we see a twinkle in his eye. But I was able to get my hands on this thick boy. Jacob giddily draws out and places on the table a massive pistol. The big iron. Jacob scratches his beard. It delivers full AP Gravis rounds with enough force to literally enter the front door and leave out the back. 9 houses later. Looper's eyebrow raises as the constable comes out. That's not legal. Jacob takes a shot. Pfft, legal? Let's not sweat the small stuff. We could all die tomorrow. Besides, if Dizzy Whiz Fizz can be sold without a prescription, then I should be able to acquire this puppy. Marshall was a bit peeved that Jacob didn't get the binoculars he promised and instead went toy shopping. He turns looking for the waiter for another round of booze for his comrades. William White Knight arrives with a tray of porcelain ribs and booze courtesy of Marshall. Injecting himself in the conversation they were having, Knight tells them that he too wishes he could be a hero and fight crime like them, specifically Jacob, whom he recognizes as a frequent patron. Marshall, Looper, and Jacob are taken back by the fact that their conversation was overheard. Looper frowns and asks, "Were you eavesdropping?" William panics a bit and deflects the question. He then tells them about a new app called the Bulwark Network where those seeking help can request do-gooders to assist them. Jacob takes another shot, trying his hardest to achieve inebriation. He burps, then adds that being a hero on an app sounds like a death wish. He describes how a man got diced in half by a wanderer android the other night for rescuing a grandmom from a fire escape. William Knight laughs and tells him he's right, it's probably risky, but well worth it. William Knight begins to daydream. He then tells him that he can't help but feel like he was someone much more in a past life. A hero. He then adds that he could use a hero right now, actually. Looper asks him to elaborate. "Oh, nothing." He blows it off. "Can I get you all anything else?" Jacob holds up 3 fingers. "Roger that, Demolition Man." Before he leaves to get the drinks, Marshall asks White for that website where he could get the Bulwark Network app thing. Knight gives him further details, then heads off. Looper places information on the table with various pictures of key criminals of interest. There's a new big fish in the bowl now who goes by Jace Oxen. He's only one of a sibling trio who are very influential and cutthroat. They've been pulling many resources and gangs together for something big. I just don't know what it is. Looper slides 3 pictures over to Jacob. We see 3 pale white faces with little to no facial features, no eyes, no ears, no nose. Jacob sees these motherfuckers and takes another shot. Marshall, with his mutated photographic memory, locks in the 3 elongated and asymmetrical faces into his memory. Jacob leans back in toward Looper. "How big is something big?" he asks. Looper informs them that word is some scary Dorinthian crime families have their eyes set on Haven during this chaotic time. Criminals that make Bloodvein and Roaring Dragons look like sitcom families. He points at a document labeled Maxima, and on it, an obscured image of a woman. Looper informs them that he believes they are meeting and nothing good can come from these people meeting. However, he believes that this meeting will also draw out the Wang Gang, or at minimum give them access to a person who can help them locate the Wang Gang. Marshall and Jacob supported Looper's hunt for the Wang Gang, as they were still currently the most aberrant gang in the streets and needed to be dealt with. All 3 agree that they will stake out, disrupt the meeting, and hopefully capture someone they could interrogate. They all toast to each other, spend the rest of the night planning and enjoying what could be their last night alive and intact. We see a gigantic sailing ship cruising across neon green waters from Dorinthia toward the northern coast of Haven City. Its blood-red sails, menacing, sharp, and jagged shapes protrude from its spines. There wasn't a nation on the planet that could engineer ships of the sea like Dorinthia. The ship's crimson flags bear a well-known and notorious emblem. Its geometry makes you feel uneasy, like a familiar fear of yours. We cut to the outside deck where we see Akari Nagamoto, a tall, curvy, and beautiful Dorinthian woman peering through a hard light telescope. Akari, or as the Dorinthian underground call her, Maxima, is the eldest daughter of Dorinthia's deadliest criminal menace, Kisuke Nagamoto, a sick, twisted, and sadistic mastermind. Was virtually untouchable. Those who opposed him simply found themselves waking up displaced and in some torturous device, or before his firing squad. Maxima was just as ruthless and clever, just not as hands-on. With the city of Haven now within sight, she begins to sharpen her strategy even more. Now on her 30th countermeasure, thousands of steps ahead. She passes the holographic telescope to a tall brute decked out in a tailored suit, his long, silky, black hair tied into a ponytail reaching past his waist. Yin, or as most know him as the yokai's deadly Muramusa, was Maxima's brother and protector. He stepped away from the yokai, a family who operate as hitmen and assassins, to become his sister's instrument. After their father Kisuke's death and Dorinthia's entire criminal organization falling into her lap, Muramusa made it his responsibility. He deactivates the telescope. It flickers away back into his watch. Maxima steps down off of the edge of the ship and walks down into the ship's quarters. She is joined by Muramusa. They walk and talk, and she shares her strategies and observations on their contact. Muramusa had reservations about Haven's kingpin, Jace Oxen, but are totally unsubstantiated, and therefore he could agree with his sister's concerns. However, both were quite confident they had it all under control. Nagamoto culture always placed knowledge of self and self-mutation in the forefront of life fulfillment and needs. The siblings were quite skilled with their gamma mutations. Muramusa had a way with those who compromised their trust, so he wasn't worried. Walking, the two reach a chest, and within it sits a Dorinthian cache, a key proponent to their negotiations with the Haven's crime lord Jace Oxen. Maxima had resources, and after long consideration has decided to establish a presence in Haven by becoming a pipeline of resource. The black market has abruptly and seemingly come to an end, making it an opportune time to intercept business. Muramusa looks over at the crate and sees a faint glowing light of the Dorinthian cache seeping through its cracks. We cut to a railway station. We see an older gentleman leaving his workplace. He's on the phone talking with his daughter, who the man brings the call to a close as he boards the railway, accompanied by several others. The Evolution District was known for its cutting-edge technology, fancy and expensive culture. A peaceful ride home on a less crowded, dated railway system was ideal for him and a great way to wind down. He lays his head back, then reaches for a newspaper and sees an article on another murder by the serial killer dubbed Switchblade. A lawyer eviscerated, leaving a Dimension Boss Stadium elevator. This city is shit, he thinks. The man shakes his head as one last passenger gets on and sits beside him. Our guy asks the new passenger if he's heard of the most recent Switchblade killing that happened in the Red Saint District. The passenger turns to him quickly. "I'ma bleed you out." A massive steak knife materializes into the stranger's hand as he goes to plunge it into our guy's midsection, when suddenly a snake made of water constricts his arm, then proceeds to bite the attacker in his knife-wielding hand, forcing him to drop the knife completely. The water snake's bite causes him to be drenched in water just as another passenger comes from behind and sends an electrifying kick into the attacker's head, sending him flying across the subway seats. Our guy, the family man, is shocked at what just transpired and looks up at the passenger who saved him. The passenger removed his hood, and his face morphs a bit as the thin mask of water blurring his face seeps back into his pores, revealing Shiro Aoi, a man who was everywhere. Every passenger on board stands up as well, revealing that they too are Shiro clones. The attacker gets back up to his feet. It was indeed Switchblade with another victim in his sights. We cut to Shiro standing in his lair watching the city from his monitor. He has all of his clones dispersed, performing separate and very important tasks. We see Shiro and Nibu studying abroad while assisting Vector over civil disorder. We then see Shiro watching the streets and fighting crime while staying out of Anarchy's spotlight. And here, we have Shiro collecting a bounty in training, a bounty he took personal. Shiro despised bullies, and Switchblade was the worst kind. Longer knives materialize in both of Switchblade's hands. His Gamma mutation gave him the ability to call into hand anything with a bladed edge. He begins to shout and utter Anarchy's rhetoric poured across the entire city. Those who can't defend themselves should be food. Heroism is enabling the weak. It's punishable by death. Shiro takes off his civilian shirt, revealing his bare and chiseled torso. A digitally inked red and white scaled dragon tattoo runs up and down his back. Its ultra-holographic clarity forced the dragon's scales to glimmer under the neon railway lights speeding by. Shiro stretches. I don't see any heroes here. Are you expecting a savior? Shiro Aoi has found himself another training partner, among many others. We swiftly cut to a Shiro clone with water katanas in hand slicing through a group of hostile G-types surrounding him. Then we cut to a Shiro clone racing another clone up a treacherous mountain in Atla, then back to the railway. Switchblade twirls a knife on his fingers and then begins running toward Shiro and immediately hurls 3 throwing knives from his sleeve with the whip of his arm. Shiro turns into vapor, allowing the knives to glide right through him, then back into a solid as he phases into the crane martial arts, which should be a suitable challenge within this rocking railway in close quarters. Definitely not his strong suit, but he enjoyed the challenge in the spirit of training. Switchblade unleashes a flurry of slashes and stabs at Shiro with murderous intent. Shiro barely avoids the maniac's attack, dips and spin dodges out of the way while on one foot landing on the passenger seat. He then sends a powerful kick across Switchblade's face, staggering him. Switchblade hurls a knife that grazes Shiro on the brow, then dodges the second one too, but the third lands deep into Shiro's leg. Shiro rolls off the chair but uses the momentum to go into a flurry of strikes. Shiro strikes his rib with an open palm that rattles his body, but then Switchblade summons a stiletto knife and stabs it into Shiro's hand, pinning it into his own abdomen. Shiro, in pain, sends a chop crashing into Switchblade's collar, then jams it into his throat. Switchblade pulls the stiletto out and turns it into a reverse edge wakizashi and stabs at Shiro but misses and gets leg swept. Switchblade falls to the ground, but not before grabbing the knife already in Shiro's thigh and dragging it down into him further. He then savagely pushes Shiro into the seat while crawling over and up onto him and begins stabbing him up. Shiro attempts to hold him at bay, but the knives were unforgivingly sharp and cut through his hands and fingers like butter. Shiro lay dead, stabbed up in a pool of blood. Switchblade stands up, licks the blood off of his knife before summoning fresh ones and twirls them as he begins walking toward the other Shiros on the other end of the railway. The Shiro in front opens his eyes after meditating on what he had learned and prepares to jump back into the fray with the killer to continue his training. 15 minutes pass and the rail cart arrives to the next stop. We see 3 dead Shiros strewn about and a tattered Shiro standing engaged with the tiring serial killer Switchblade. Shiro puts his leg down from crane stance and clenches his fist as it begins to glow with electrical radiance. He had enough of training for the day. We cut to the outside of the railway. The subway doors open up. Soon after, the rescued passenger can be seen darting out of the double doors to his vehicle, to his family. Shiro Aoi comes walking out, dragging an unconscious and soaking wet Switchblade, whose body is still trembling from the jolts of electricity. Shiro's dead clone bodies turn to water behind him, leaving no trace. We cut back to the Shiro clone monitoring the streets. He has his eyes set on a group of what most would consider society's outcast G-types congregating. Nivel Threndorn's gigantic bubble was currently keeping the irradiated societies below. at bay. This allowed Shiro to focus on other citywide issues, such as G-types going missing. All his leads point toward locations where crime and chaos was at its peak. It always occurred during back alleyway assemblies of self-proclaimed alpha G-types looking to fight their way into Anarchy's enforcers. Shiro didn't buy those rumors though. He knows Anarchy would never put that much confidence into a living being, but it was worth investigating nonetheless. 2 black vans and a car pull up into the back alleyway beside the G-types waiting. He sees a straight-edged businessman get out of the vehicle, but he didn't recognize them. The man speaks to all of them and invites them on board into the van. A few G-types weren't selected to get on, however, and were left behind, but most of them did. Shiro watches the 2 vans depart from the car that accompanied them and onto an off-road, and then they stop. Suddenly, what appears to be an outline of a large spacecraft appears and silently hovers above the vans. Naked to the normal eye, Shiro sees it through his mid-tech binoculars and watches it cast a beam onto the vans and pull them up into the ship and flies off. Shiro was confused about what he just saw. Perhaps what the internet was saying is true. Maybe the Survey Day are again kidnapping people. Tempest was right, he thinks. He smirks, because he knows he'll find out soon enough. We cut to the port district of Haven, known as Bloodcobble District. A district left to rot as the crime rings become more and more influential. The only way out of Bloodcobble tends to lie in endearing oneself to the crime lords. And more than a few people end up getting roped into Haven's criminal underbelly on empty promises of a better outside. The only way out of Bloodcobble tends to lie in endearing oneself to the crime lords. And more than a few people end up getting roped into Haven's criminal underbelly on empty promises of a better life outside of the district. An armored limousine pulls up to the docks beside a few other small groups of gang factions. A growing up-and-coming Bloodcobble gang, among them a brolic and eccentric-looking crime boss, Darius Dwanhart, leader of the pack. A growing and up-and-coming Bloodcobble gang. Lately, they've been making moves, and tonight was just another night. Darius walks up toward the limousine to greet those coming out of it. Stepping out of the limo were several gangsters. Among them, Jason Oxen. No one has ever really seen him before, let alone them. Darius was caught off guard when he sees that Jason Oxen was accompanied by 2 twin brothers. It was no wonder he was so successful. There were 3 of them. With their odd, blank and deformed faces, it was nearly impossible to read their emotions. But Jason Oxen could have you killed on the spot because many respected and spoke positive of him even behind his back. Jason and Darius shake hands, and he asks Darius if everything is going as planned. Darius informs him that the Nagamatos should be arriving soon with the Dorinthian cachet. Jace Oxen nods and he begins to speak to the other crime lords he gathered here. He explains to all of them that he has called them here to witness the ascension of his criminal empire and rise to godhood. The gangsters look at each other in disbelief, with the majority thinking he's off of his rocker. However, they underestimate Jace. Using his connections in business negotiation, Jace Oxen has worked out an unprecedented international deal with the notorious Nagamoto family. They would provide an ancient Dorinthian artifact to him in return for access to Haven's underground market, which has been monopolized by Anarchy. Whatever item Jace Oxen was acquiring tonight from the Nagamatos, he was damn certain that it would provide absolute power. He gives every crime boss there an early opportunity to bow down peacefully before his ascension. He walks around to each boss, shaking their hand to solidify their alliance. Just then, we see large, 6-wheeled armored vehicles pull up. Jace Oxen looks at Darius. Hey, I thought the Nagamatos were arriving by sea. Who are these other guests, Darius? Darius looks guilty. Jace Oxen begins to suspect that their rendezvous location has been exposed to an outside party. Stepping out of the truck, we see Noxious Wong and the Wang Gang, menacing as ever, bobbing their heads to the tune in their headphones. Noxious is dressed in fresh and dapper clothes, however his sleeves, burnt black from the raging flames that spawn from his hands. Dravko Maz steps out of the other truck with his goons. Tall and brolic, Drav sets his reptilian eyes upon Jace Oxen and the other gangs down below at the docks. The Wang Ganger aim their rifles down at everyone. Drav had them all right where he wanted them, thanks to Darius. Drav leaps off of the high cliff and down onto the docks, followed by Noxious Wong, who cushions his fall with a bed of flame. Jace Oxen turns to Darius and calls him a traitor. Darius rebuttals and informs Jason that he's underestimating Drav's power and influence. Jason cuts him off and tells him to go for a swim. After the command is given, Darius is overcome with a sense of duty. He turns directly around and runs off of the dock to dive into the sea, swimming directly to the bottom of the ocean to intentionally drown himself. He also slits his throat on the way down. Dravko Maz approaches Jace Oxen and expresses his sorrow for the suicide of such a loyal ally.
I don't know what you told him to make him jump, but you may want to convince yourself to do the same if you're not willing to fall in line, Jace Oxen.
Jace thinks to himself and looks over at the other two and the other crime lords. He was not in any position to say anything, but no. With the Wang Gang up above, aiming their rifles down at them, the almighty Dravko Maz in front of him backed by Noxious Wong and all of the top crime lords, Jace knew he would need to play along for now. Drav begins to tell the other crime lords that whatever alliance that they just made with Jason Oxen is now void. They are now serving Drav, or else they will die where they stand. A brave and foolish crime boss steps forward. He was known as Papa Goth Dog, a ringleader of the Nibunese thugs. He was merciless when it came to insults, but he let Drav off easy though, and simply does an impression of him. It was a good one too, heavily emphasizing his heavy, draconic breathing, the fiery bass in his voice, stomping while making horns with the points of his fingers and saying stereotypical fantasy dragon things. Drav approaches and without saying anything stops on the dime and smoothly and gracefully roundhouse kicks the living shit out of his entire body, sending his broken remains tumbling across the dock toward the feet of the other crime bosses. Dead. Drav turns and asks if anyone else wants to oppose. No one says anything. This was a big deal, as each of these bosses at the docks were major movers and shakers. Hell, it's why Jason assembled them, but now they're in the clutches and control of Dravko Maz. Jace Oxen extends his hand to Drav to concede. Drav smacks his hand away and points at each of his blank-faced twin brothers and tells them to fall in line. They each look at each other, then back to the primary Jace Oxen. Jace subtly tells them to stand down. Drav puts his large, scaly hand on Jason's shoulder.
I heard you have a gift on its way for me, Jason.
It turns out that Darius Duanhart even told Drav about the shipment coming from his soon-to-be partners from Dorinthia. The last thing you want your guests to see is you getting strong-armed in a city that you supposedly run. Jason thinks. Jason nods his head, signaling that it's all his. Drav nods back.
Good boy. I'll need you to introduce me to our visitors when they arrive.
Time passes, and the Dorinthian ship arrives to the dock. Stepping off of the ship with a small squad of armed Dorinthian gangsters, we see Maxima and Muramusa Nagamoto walking side by side. Muramusa is carrying the heavy crate in his arms as they make their way toward the congregation of awaiting crime lords. Maxima looks around. She spots Noxious Wong playing with fire in his hands, then sees Drav's draconic visage. She knew Haven was incredibly irradiated, but she wasn't expecting to see G-types within moments of arriving. She immediately switches gears to her 23rd plan that took into account the presence of unknown parties and G-types. Jace Oxen steps forward and introduces himself and thanks her for her arrival with the Dorinthian cachet. Both her and her brother nod, acknowledging his welcoming words. Muramusa and Drav size each other up. Drav was tall, muscular and plated with scales, but even still was only up just a notch on the Brolic scale over Muramusa. His Dorinthian silk suit was expertly crafted, as not one of his bulging muscles were anything the threads couldn't handle. Muramusa eyes him with intensity, his long ponytail flowing in the wind as if submerged underwater. Jace Oxen explains to Maxima that he actually works for Dravco, and Dravco is the one who will be taking the Dorinthian cachet, and is also the one who will be providing access to the black market. Maxima sees what has happened before her arrival. An old-fashioned shakedown and takeover. She wasn't stupid. She saw no benefit in defending Jason, especially if this Dragon G-type was the one calling the shots in the city. She goes along with the shift in power. Maxima looks away from Jason, no longer interested, now irrelevant to her and her plans, and focuses on Drav. Using her master telepathy mutation, Maxima infiltrates Drav's mind in search of his desire. She discovers his will to take over Haven's underground, dissects his intentions, and uses that information to weave an enticing deal that pulls on his psychological strings. Drav Komaz agrees to her terms, making her his criminal empire's main and only pipeline for resources directly from Dorinthia. This was right on time now that the black market has been mysteriously locked down. Dravco wasn't expecting to gain any additional benefit from this strong arm, but is glad to have made the new connect in making Maxima a lieutenant of Dorinthian affairs. Little does he know the smaller details and nuances of their deal benefit her more in the grand scheme, but not so much that Drav notices or believes her to be a threat. He wasn't smart when it came to true business strategy like she was, susceptible to the manipulation of superior business tycoons. Drav asks them to open the crate and reveal his gift. Maxima gives Muramusa the signal, and Mura pulls the Dorinthian cachet from the crate when suddenly a giant rocket comes soaring across the sky, hitting and obliterating the entire cliff where the majority of the Wang Gang resided, sending them flying and tumbling down, killing many if not all of them. We cut to Jacob Bastian across the way, perched on a cliff, holding and keeping his massive rocket launcher steady. Spotting for him, with a pair of antique binoculars Looper was able to acquire from his old Western Ward weapon locker, we see Marshall Mesa sporting brown shorts and a cotton t-shirt that reads, "It's high noon for tea time." Jacob shouts for Marshall to retrieve the Smoky Bear. With photographic memory, Marshall reaches into a backpack loaded with Jacob's exotic firearms, munitions, and a large flag protruding from it bearing their ward's emblem. He discovers the Smoky Bear rocket nestled deep in a pile of black market shells and Mesa Mart trinkets. Marshall hands the rocket over to Jacob. The rocket itself had a black teddy bear dangling from it and was expected to be super effective. Hell, it was chemical warfare. Jacob has been wanting to use it for some time now. He loads it in while Marshall Mesa uses his photographic full-spectrum vision to provide superior battlefield awareness and clarity. Jacob presses a few buttons on the rocket, maximizing its capabilities, then fires the rocket directly into the docks, causing a massive explosion and a dense mushroom cloud of pure darkness, blinding everyone in its radius.
Jacob landed it dead on target, engulfing Maxima, Muramusa, Drath, Noxious, and Jason Oxen in a thick, almost liquid-like smog, filling their lungs with an irritating pollutant that amasses like tar, making it painfully difficult to inhale and exhale. We see many of the crime lords suffocate and choke on their own vomit, unable to escape their throats. Maxima falls to her knees, unable to inhale, and begins crawling toward the edge of the docks and rolls herself into the water to escape the Smokey Bear's miasma from harming her any further. From behind Marshall and Jacob, and with a running start, we then see Looper Kin dive from off of the cliff, launching himself into the air toward the docks below. Impressive for his size and age, Looper's ordinary genetics were a bit more utilized than other ordinaries thanks to his constable training. His brick-shaped body comes crash-landing on top of a thug, crushing him dead from the impact alone, thus breaking his fall. Looper bounces up off of his body and begins blasting his hand cannon, taking out the blinded victims disoriented by the Smokey Bear. All of this was a well-crafted ambush and Looper's brainchild. The ambush was unfolding just as they all thought it would. Every bullet leaving the chamber of his hand cannon blows open the heads and chest cavities of the targets he hits, never missing a shot. Looper was usually conscious of who he was looking to kill and maim, but things at the moment were pretty dire. He had every intention of laying these fools down for good, especially when it came to the Wang Gang. A Wang gangster begins to blindly spray in his direction, forcing Looper to crouch run behind cover while moving in toward Noxious. Noxious struggles to gather his composure from gagging, but manages to spot Looper moving in on him. He immediately recognizes the blocky ordinary because they have played cat and mouse for years, often alternating roles of who was cat and who was mouse, and today, Noxious knew what he was. He begins to flee toward the dock cliffs. Jacob, while running in after Looper to support him, swiftly switches to a massively large rifle that wraps itself around his forearm to stabilize, and he begins pumping out 100 rounds per second, providing overwhelming cover fire and gives the sense that an entire army was blowing up the spot. Marshall watches and observes Jacob and Looper's handling of their firearms and commits their form to memory. He turns around and retrieves one of Jacob's pistols and runs in after them. He hasn't really gotten the hang of his mutation, so the gun is what he could rely on for now. Marshall notices Wang Gang reinforcements meeting Noxious halfway and preparing an ambush for Looper as he tells him. Marshall warns Looper and saves him from a bad situation. Looper hates to let Noxious escape again, but is content with the show of force and justice that they have displayed today. Noxious and Looper make eye contact, and Noxious flees. Looper spots another Wang Ganger choking and gagging, and decides that he will be the target they capture for interrogation. Looper works his way back and covers his face with his WWC gas mask while utilizing his natural night vision inside of the Smokey Bear miasma. Looper steps over Dravko Maz, who we see choking violently as he attempts to spit up acid to corrode away the oozing smoky vapors coating his throat and lungs. Looper spots the Wang gangster crawling up on the Dorinthian cache to get to his feet. Looper walks over and grabs the gangster by his collar and pulls him close to his gas-masked face and tells him that he's under arrest, and punches his lights out. Pow! Looper throws him over his back and radios in to Jacob and asks how much more time they have till the miasma fades. Jacob laughs. Smokey Bears don't fade for weeks. We have plenty of time. Good, Looper replies. He sets his eyes on the Dorinthian cache. It's time they come looking for me for a change. Come help me carry some luggage, Jacob. Looper turns and walks out of the miasma when suddenly Looper is grabbed by the back of his neck with super strength and is reverse chokeslammed face first into the docks, causing major damage to the immediate area. Dazed and with a partially crooked gas mask, Looper sees the face of the deeply angered Muramusa, who is no longer fazed by the toxic cloud. His healing mutation purges his lungs of the toxicity and repairs his immune system in a matter of moments. Musa maneuvers across Looper's body into an advantageous position and throws several violent elbows, the third completely shattering his gas mask, the fourth knocking into his head so hard it makes Looper see bright lights for an entire second. Looper's tough lungs, along with growing up around the Western Ward mines, allowed Looper to endure the miasma easier than most. However, he knew spending too much time in this mist, tussling with Ponytail McBuffsuit, could be lethal in the long term. Musa unleashes what seemed like 10 to 12 rapid-fire haymakers at supernatural speed. Looper blocks the majority and grabs onto his arm, pulling him in for a no-nonsense Looper headbutt. Pow! Both heads collide, disorienting them, long enough to buy Looper time to make a move. Looper grabs a loose plank from the shattered dock and comes across Musa's head with it. A loud whack echoes across the sea. The plank breaks, but Musa isn't even phased and leaps toward Looper. Looper back rolls and attempts to spring Musa backwards with his legs, but Musa, with supernatural conditioning and mastery of mixed martial arts, captures Looper's legs and contorts them into positions they aren't supposed to be in. Looper hasn't experienced this much 360 range on his fucking joints since high school and succumbs to an uncommon and excruciating pain as Muir tries to break his legs in a leg lock. Looper crawls backward in agony, attempting to throw himself off of the dock, taking Musa with him. Perhaps the water could change the tide a bit. Looper manages to wiggle off, but Musa's brute strength holding on to the dock while he keeps Looper's entire body suspended via leg lock leaves Looper dangling upside down in pain. Looper leans up and pounds as hard as he can on Musa's kneecaps, busting them wide apart, turning his white pants into a deep red. Musa shouts in pain and lets go of Looper's legs, but Looper grabs onto Musa's legs and pulls him into the water with him. Looper and Musa begin to rumble, grab, pull, and clobber one another while floating in the water. Meanwhile, Marshall and Jacob can be seen hauling the Dorinthian cache into their vehicle along with the unconscious Wanganger. Marshal Mesa comes across the head of a few other gangsters with the flagpole just because. Marshall and Jacob finally get the cache into the vehicle, and Marshall asks if he thinks Looper needs help down there. Jacob says nah. He points to Drafco Maz crawling out of the mist, however, and they hear Wangang motorcycles approaching in the distance. We gotta go soon though. Jacob and Marshall run back over to the docks where they see Musa and Looper still fighting in the water. Looper was tough enough to endure Musa's tireless assault. Musa's yokai instincts begin to tick until he realizes his main goal is his sister. He turns around and spots Maxima suffocating from the smoky bear miasma and soon to begin drowning. Musa looks at Looper, points, and then immediately abandons him to go to his sister's aid. Looper wipes blood from his nose. It was uncommon for a normal person to hit so hard, Looper thinks. He swims back to the dock where he is pulled up by Jacob and Marshall. Marshall pats Looper on the shoulder and hands him a Dizzy Fizz Whiz bar. Looper, catching his breath, thanks him. When suddenly, charging across the docks and out of the smoky bear miasma, Drafco Maz comes charging toward all three of them, blinded and spewing acid from his gaping dragon mouth. Marshall shouts, "Look out!" Jacob, in one swift motion, turns and aims the big iron toward Draf. And just as he gets within 5 yards, Jacob sends a piping lava-hot AP Gravis round blasting out of his gun and smashes square in the Draf's chest, partially burrowing through his plated scales, spinning rapidly, causing a vortex of shredding force. Drav is taken off of his feet and is blasted 50 to 75 yards across the docks, crashing and rolling into some storage crates. Jacob looks at his gun, somewhat impressed, but disappointed it didn't go through him as he planned. Jacob adds it to his list of weapon modifications to make. Looper and company hop into the vehicle along with the Dorinthian cache and a Wanganger, who starts to become conscious again before Marshall clobbers him over the head with the flagpole. Looper peers down at the docks with his binoculars and sees Musa dragging Maxima to her feet. She and her brother glance over at Looper and company just as the sun breaks through the clouds and shines upon their cliff. It was at this moment they realized that Haven may not be as lost as the world thought, and that there still might be some order. Looper bangs on the top of the Jeep, signaling to Jacob to roll out. Jacob pulls off, but not before leaning out of the driver's side and giving them all the finger. We see Jason Oxen being pulled out of the miasma by his twin brothers. Jason chokes and gags, his lungs filled with fiery pins and needles. He looks around and sees the gangs devastated, most dead. Dravko Maz lays unconscious yards away, the crime lords lay dead within the Smoky Bear, and he sees the Dorinthian gangsters also dead. Jace Oxen notices the cache has been taken by their attackers as well. Either the Nagamatos will think this was a setup, or the Wang Gang will blame Dravko's condition on them. Jason decides to get the fuck out of Dodge. He calls in a helicopter that he had on standby and departs before the Wang Gangers arrive. Moments later, Noxious returns to the docks to retrieve their boss, Dravko Maz, with reinforcements. He spots the Nagamatos getting on their ship and decides to press them for questions. Noxious starts off by greeting them with an assortment of foul and disrespectful names. Noxious had little respect or knowledge of the Nagamatos, if he only knew that their crime family was heavily tied to the birth of the true Wang Gang from Dorinthia that his gang was inspired by. Miramusa turns his head and sets his demonic gaze on Noxious, who doesn't stop the insults and even threatens to incinerate their ship. Miramusa begins to walk down the ship bridge, but Maxima stops him. She then looks at Noxious Wong. She infiltrates his mind using her telepathy, and like bringing a scythe across a swath of crops, she completely severs off every shred of academia he knows, from language to numbers, from his brain. She then compresses, then suppresses the memory, crams it deep into the back center of his brain to where it could never be recovered naturally again. The mental jolt caused by the unnatural shift of cognition within his brain was so jarring, it caused streams of blood to spew from his nose and sends him stumbling backward while fumbling his speech to the point of drooling. Addled beyond repair, Noxious falls to the ground, completely holding his head, dizzy and disoriented. Maxima grabs Miramusa's hand. "Come, Yin. We have urgent matters to tend to," as she whips out her phone and begins making calls while walking into the ship. We see Marshall Mesa going through a pile of the Wang Gangers' belongings that have been placed on the table. Marshall, curious as to why all the Wang Gangers wear headphones 24/7, grabs and places them over his ears and presses play. He is immediately subjected to demonic and hypnotizing mantras over lo-fi hip-hop beats. If it weren't for the mutated hypercognitive inner workings of his own brain, Marshall could have been affected in some shape or form. He immediately takes them off and tries to imagine what goes through a man's mind that is subject to bizarre bullshit for 24/7. He walks over to the two-way glass and observes the Wang Ganger, who sits slumped and shackled to the chair, staring at the window with dead eyes. Just then, Looper and Jacob enter the room, both incredibly intimidating. Jacob appears pissed off. Looper told Jacob about all the heinous acts that the Wang Gang had performed on the way to this abandoned Western Ward jail that he never turned his keys into. Looper was breaking all kinds of laws these days. Could you blame him though? He's been held back by the law and attempts to uphold the law for all of his career. Today was a new chapter. To hell with the law. Looper begins to interrogate. He begins by asking who is their current leader. In his native language, the Wang Ganger tells Looper that Soak will reign for eternity and to lick his ass crack. Looper tightens his fist until it is as solid as a cement block and jabs him right in his shit, breaking his nose open, flooding his shirt with a river of blood. We cut to Marshall flinching from the crackling punch. Marshall suddenly receives a phone call from the closing manager at Mesa Mart, calling to tell him that the Tombot has arrived and that she's locking it in the back. Marshall tells her to make sure that it's locked up good. That thing cost a lot of money. He also tells her to make sure that the flag display is ready, front stage and center for opening tomorrow. But before he lets her go, he asks if she ever heard of the Bulwark Network. Awkward. She hesitates, and then tells him that he shouldn't talk about those things over the phone. Marshall tells her goodnight. Then he thinks to himself, how long should something so noble, such as the Bulwark Network, be suppressed? Needs to put their resources into it. He considers it. He suddenly hears the pitter-patter of tiny feet up in the vents of this ruined facility, and in drops a rat from the ceiling. It lands, bounces and rolls and scurries over to Marshall, where we see it carrying a note. Marshall's eyebrow raises. We cut back to the interrogation room where we see Jacob gripping up the Wanganger, demanding he talk. Looper pulls Jacob off of him. Neither Jacob nor Looper had any ounce of diplomacy in them, and this guy could really take a beating. Jacob pulls out a cylinder-shaped bomb and begins wailing at the Wanganger, beating him near death. Looper grabs Jacob and slams him into the wall. Pain can be seen smoldering in Jacob's eyes. What Looper told Jacob today was a major revelation and answered a lot of unanswered questions in regards to something pivotal that happened in his past. He was having a hard time digesting it, but Looper needed to tell him this so he could see just how bad these people were. Looper walks over to the beaten Wangangster and asks him a different question. Who is Dravko Moss? The Wanganger resents Dravko since the day he met him and blames all of this on him. He spits blood on Looper's flannel and tells Looper everything about Dravko's takeover of the underground criminal network, including the Nagamatos. Looper's heart drops. The thought of a unified international criminal network during Haven's lowest time was nothing short of an apocalypse. Jacob calms down a bit as he begins to think about all the contract work that would be produced from some sort of alliance like that, a mercenary renaissance. But he buries his vices for now and asks their captive about what's in the cache. The Wanganger tells him the hell if he knows. Looper walks over to it and opens up the cache, releasing green light trapped inside. Inside, we see a prosthetic forearm with a 3-fingered hand, comprised of perpetual hard light. The Fist of the Endless was an ancient and religious artifact to the Dorinthian people that contained what some would say infinite power. It's an appendage that most believe belonged to gods, and once surgically attached, you gain all of its glory. But none of them know that. Jacob and Looper's eyes are filled to the brim with the red light emanating from it. Marshall, who we now see standing in the doorway, is taken back by its glory. He approaches and asks, what does it do? Both Looper and Jacob do not recall any history on such an item. Looper smiles. What it does is it helps us find who we're looking for. Jacob slides his hand across the device. It vibrates warm to the touch. It's dangerous, Jacob says. And Looper agrees and adds that it's good when it's in the right hands, don't you think? Great work today, fellas. Looper pats Jacob on the shoulder and shakes his hand, and then goes to shake Marshall's hand. Marshall says, wait, I got something to show y'all. He pulls out the note that he retrieved from the messenger rat. It reads, "You're making a difference. The Bulwark Network needs you." It then goes on to give them a time and a meeting place, and at the end of the note, warns them that androids came to Palladia searching for the blonde. Looper looks at Marshall. Marshall looks at Jacob. Jacob laughs, picks up his gun bag, and says, "Well, he ain't talking about me." Marshall asks if any of them know who the signer Michael Holland is. Doesn't ring any bells. Marshall folds up the note. They all shrug and consider meeting this person. Looper looks down at the fist of the Endless and shuts the crate.